Most people picture Lebensborn as a twisted breeding farm where women were paired with SS officers like livestock. The truth is far more sinister and complex. Lebensborn was not one program but two operating in tandem. A dual system that combined secretive maternity homes in Germany with an industrial-scale kidnapping and identity erasure machine across occupied Europe. This is the story of how the Nazi state turned racial ideology into bureaucratic procedure, how they stole thousands of children, and why the legal system failed to hold the architects fully accountable. On December 12, 1935, Heinrich Himmler signed the founding order for Lebensborn, which translates to Fountain of Life or Wellspring of Life. The document framed the program as a response to what Nazis perceived as a demographic crisis. Germany's birth rate had been declining, and Himmler was obsessed with the idea that the so-called Aryan race was being outbred by people he considered racially inferior. The founding decree stated that Lebensborn would support racially and biologically hereditarily valuable families. This language was no accident. Every word had been carefully chosen to mask eugenics as social welfare. Himmler placed Lebensborn under the authority of the SS Race and Settlement Main Office, known by its German acronym RU-SCHA. This office was responsible for vetting SS marriages, ensuring that members of the elite guard only married women deemed racially pure. By embedding Lebensborn within RU-SCHA, Himmler made clear from the beginning that this was not about helping all German mothers. It was about increasing births within a narrow racial category while simultaneously preventing births among those labeled undesirable. The program combined pronatalism for the chosen few with the sterilization and murder of millions deemed unworthy of life. In practice, Lebensborn operated through a network of maternity homes established across Germany and later in occupied territories including Norway, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Austria, and Poland. These were not hospitals in the traditional sense. They were ideological laboratories where Nazi racial theory was applied to pregnancy and motherhood. The first home opened in 1936 in the Bavarian village of Steinhering. By the end of the war, there were at least 24 such facilities spread across Nazi-controlled Europe. The homes served a specific demographic. Unmarried German women who were pregnant and could prove their racial purity were offered anonymity, medical care, and financial support. In a society where illegitimate pregnancy carried severe social stigma, Lebensborn offered a lifeline, but one with strings attached. To gain entry, women had to submit to racial examinations. SS doctors measured skulls, examined hair and eye color, documented family trees, and assessed physical characteristics against pseudoscientific racial charts. Women who passed were admitted. Those who failed were turned away, sometimes directed toward forced sterilization or abortion. Inside the homes, care was professional by the standards of the time. Mothers received prenatal care, delivered their babies under medical supervision, and were given weeks of postnatal recovery. The facilities were clean, well-staffed, and equipped, but this care came with indoctrination. The walls were decorated with SS runes and Nazi symbols. Mothers attended lectures on racial hygiene and the importance of bearing children for the Führer. Many mothers who gave birth in these homes later reported feeling pressure to relinquish their children for adoption by SS families, although they were not forced. The children born in these homes were registered with the SS rather than through normal civil channels, creating a parallel bureaucracy that tracked racially valuable offspring. Over the course of the program's existence, approximately 7,000 children were born in Lebensborn homes within Germany. This number is often cited to argue that the program was small and relatively insignificant. But this narrow focus on voluntary births in Germany obscures the second and far more devastating prong of the Lebensborn system. Starting in 1939 with the invasion of Poland, and accelerating after the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Lebensborn became the endpoint of a vast kidnapping operation. The logic was straightforward in the minds of Nazi planners. If there were racially valuable children living among Slavic populations in the East, those children must be descendants of ancient Germanic settlers. Therefore, they were German by blood even if they spoke Polish, Ukrainian, or Russian. Nazi ideology demanded they be reclaimed. The process began with scouting. SS officers, RU-SCHA agents, and local collaborators traveled through occupied territories identifying children who displayed so-called Aryan characteristics. Blonde hair, blue or green eyes, light skin, certain facial structures. These children were photographed, measured, and documented on racial examination forms that assigned numerical scores to physical features. Children who scored high enough were marked for seizure. The methods of seizure varied. In some cases, children were taken from orphanages or hospitals. In others, they were abducted directly from their families. Parents might return home to find their child missing, taken by authorities with no explanation. In Poland, especially, the scale was staggering. Entire villages were screened. Children were taken during mass deportations, separated from parents being sent to labor camps or execution sites. Some children were so young they could not remember their original names or families. Once seized, children entered the Germanization pipeline. They were transported by train and truck to temporary holding centers, then on to Lebensborn facilities or other Germanization institutions run by the National Socialist People's Welfare Organization. The paperwork was meticulous. Transport manifests listed each child by a temporary identification number. At the receiving facility, records documented their arrival, physical description, and assigned new identity. Original names were erased. Birth dates were often changed. Children were given German names, usually chosen to obscure any trace of their origin. The Germanization process was systematic and brutal. Children were forbidden to speak their native languages. Those who disobeyed were beaten or isolated. Older children who resisted were sometimes sent to special camps or juvenile detention centers where conditions were harsh. Younger children, especially those under 6, were considered ideal because their identities were still forming. They were immersed in German language and Nazi ideology. Many were placed with German families, often SS members or loyal party officials, who adopted them formally or informally. These families were told the children were German orphans or the offspring of SS men killed in combat. The bureaucratic machinery that enabled this system left an extensive paper trail. Founding decrees spelled out the racial objectives. Rue-Shaw worksheets recorded the measurements and evaluations of individual children. Transport logs documented movements across territories. Placement records tracked which children went to which families. This was not a spontaneous crime carried out by rogue actors. It was a state-run, systematized operation with clear chains of command, standardized procedures, and institutional oversight reaching to the highest levels of the SS. Historians have documented tens of thousands of children who were kidnapped and subjected to Germanization. The exact number remains uncertain because records were destroyed in the final months of the war and many children were never recovered. Estimates range from 20,000 to over 200,000 depending on how broadly the parameters are defined. What is certain is that thousands of children passed directly through Lebensborn facilities, while many more were processed through parallel Germanization programs that shared the same ideology and methods. The human cost of this system cannot be measured in numbers alone. Consider the experience of a single child, a 6-year-old girl taken from her Polish mother during a roundup. She arrives at a center frightened, speaking only Polish. She is told her name is no longer her name. She is struck when she asks for her mother in her own language. Within months, she is speaking German, living with a new family who call her by a German name and tell her she was always German. Years pass, the war ends. She is now 10 years old, her early memories faded and confused. Authorities attempt to repatriate her, but she no longer remembers her birth name clearly. Her mother, if she survived, is searching through lists of missing children with only a fading photograph and the memory of a daughter who may no longer recognize her. This scenario played out thousands of times in the years after the war. Allied authorities and the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration worked to identify and return kidnapped children. The process was agonizing. Many children had been too young to remember their origins. Others had been so thoroughly indoctrinated they believed they were German and resisted repatriation. Some were successfully returned to surviving family members, but the reunions were often fraught. Children had forgotten their native languages. They had internalized Nazi ideology. Parents had been traumatized by years of fear and loss. For many, the psychological damage was irreversible. In the immediate aftermath of the war, attention turned to accountability. The Nuremberg trials included a specific case targeting the leaders of Rue-Shaw. The Rue-Shaw trial, officially United States of America versus Ulrich Greifeld and others, ran from October 1947 to March 1948. Among the 14 defendants were several men directly involved in Lebensborn and the Germanization program. The prosecution presented extensive evidence of the kidnapping operation. Witnesses testified. Documents were entered into evidence. The tribunal concluded that the defendants had participated in a systematic program to kidnap children of foreign nationality in order to select for Germanization those who were considered of racial value. However, the legal outcomes were complex and in many cases unsatisfying. Max Salman, a senior Rue Shah official who oversaw racial examinations, was convicted and sentenced to time served, meaning he walked free almost immediately. Greyfelt himself received a prison sentence but was released early. Other defendants received relatively light sentences or were acquitted on certain charges. The tribunal acknowledged the atrocity of the kidnappings but struggled with questions of individual culpability within a bureaucratic machine. Critically, Lebensborn itself was often treated in legal proceedings as a passive institution. The argument went that Lebensborn facilities received children who had already been seized by other agencies. Lebensborn staff provided care and facilitated adoption, but they were not the ones doing the physical abducting. This legal distinction created a gap in accountability. The people who pulled children from their homes were often Wehrmacht soldiers, local police, or SS units operating in the field. The people who ran the Germanization centers, including Lebensborn homes, could claim they were simply following orders and providing welfare services to children already in state custody. This framing obscured the moral reality. Lebensborn was not merely a receiver. It was an integral part of the pipeline. Without Lebensborn and similar institutions, there would have been nowhere to send the kidnapped children. The existence of these facilities enabled and incentivized the abductions. The racial examinations conducted by Lebensborn personnel determined which children were worth stealing. The adoption networks maintained by Lebensborn ensured that stolen children disappeared into German society. To separate the institution from the crime is to misunderstand how atrocity functions within a bureaucratic state. The post-war legal struggles to address Lebensborn reveal a broader challenge. How do you hold accountable a system where individuals perform discrete tasks, each of which might seem defensible in isolation, but which collectively constitute a monstrous crime? The nurse who cared for a child did not personally kidnap that child. The clerk who filed adoption papers did not personally erase the child's identity. The administrator who ran the facility did not personally decide racial policy. Yet without each of these roles, the system could not function. The banality of evil, a concept later articulated by Hannah Arendt, was on full display in the Lebensborn apparatus. Another layer of complexity emerged in the trials and subsequent historical research concerning the perception of the program. Some defenders of Lebensborn argued then, and continue to argue now, that the maternity homes in Germany proper were genuinely beneficial institutions that helped unmarried mothers in difficult circumstances. They point to testimonies from women who felt they received compassionate care. They emphasize that many mothers kept their children rather than giving them up for adoption. They highlight that no evidence suggests women were forced to become pregnant or coerced into relationships with SS men, which would have been the hallmark of a literal breeding farm. These points, while factually accurate in certain contexts, miss the forest for the trees. The voluntary maternity homes and the kidnapping pipeline were not separate programs. They were two expressions of the same ideology. Both were predicated on the belief that some lives are inherently more valuable because of racial characteristics. Both employed pseudoscientific racial examinations to sort human beings into categories of worthy and unworthy. Both sought to engineer the genetic future of a nation. The fact that one mechanism used social services while the other used abduction does not change the underlying purpose. Lebensborn was both welfare program and kidnapping machine, and understanding it requires holding both truths simultaneously. If we measure Lebensborn's success by the Nazi regime's own goals, it was largely a failure in one dimension and a catastrophe in another. The demographic goal of significantly increasing the Aryan birth rate was not achieved. 7,000 births over 9 years in Germany is a negligible impact on a national population of tens of millions. Even accounting for births in occupied territories, the numbers were too small to shift demographic trends. Himmler had envisioned a vast expansion of the program, with plans for more homes and broader recruitment, but resource constraints and the chaos of war limited the scale. However, Lebensborn succeeded in a darker sense. It demonstrated that a modern state could mobilize bureaucracy, medicine, and law to enact racial ideology. It showed that ordinary professionals could be integrated into systems of terror. It proved that children could be stolen, reprogrammed, and disappeared into a new identity with chilling efficiency. The operational success of the kidnapping and Germanization pipeline is one of the most disturbing aspects of the program. The Nazis did not fail because the system was ineffective. They failed because they lost the war. The aftermath for survivors has been lifelong. Many stolen children never learned their true origins. They grew up believing they were German, only to discover decades later through historical research or chance encounters that their entire identity was a fabrication. Others lived with fragmented memories and a persistent sense of something missing. Some dedicated their lives to searching for their birth families, often without success. Survivors who came forward in the post-war decades faced disbelief and denial. German society was reluctant to confront this chapter of history, and many former Lebensborn children felt isolated and stigmatized. There were also children born in the voluntary maternity homes who faced their own struggles. In post-war Germany, they were sometimes ostracized as SS children or the offspring of unmarried mothers. Despite having done nothing wrong, they carried a social stain. Some grew up not knowing they were Lebensborn children until adulthood. When they discovered the truth, many grappled with questions about their fathers, who were often SS men. What does it mean to be born into an ideology you had no choice in? How do you integrate that knowledge into your sense of self? One particularly painful irony emerged in Norway, which had the largest number of Lebensborn children born outside Germany. Norwegian women who had relationships with German soldiers during the occupation gave birth to an estimated 10,000 to 12,000 children, many in Lebensborn homes. After the war, these children and their mothers faced brutal social persecution. Mothers were labeled traitors. Children were bullied, institutionalized at high rates, and denied opportunities. The Norwegian government eventually issued an apology and compensation in the early 2000s, acknowledging the injustice. Yet the scars remain. The ideological legacy of Lebensborn extends beyond individual trauma. The program was built on ideas that have not disappeared. The notion that a nation's strength is tied to the racial purity of its population still circulates in far-right movements today. Rhetoric about demographic replacement, about preserving bloodlines, about the existential threat posed by outsiders reproducing faster than the native population. These arguments echo the language used to justify Lebensborn. Contemporary movements in Europe and North America that promote white nationalism or ethno-nationalism draw on the same reservoir of racial anxiety that Himmler tapped into. This is not to equate every restrictive immigration policy or every concern about birth rates with Nazism. It is to recognize that the underlying logic, the idea that identity is rooted in biology and that the state has an interest in managing reproduction along ethnic lines, remains politically potent. When political leaders speak of preserving national identity by limiting births among certain groups or encouraging births among others, they are walking a path that leads back to programs like Lebensborn. History does not repeat itself exactly, but the patterns and the rationalizations are disturbingly familiar. Understanding Lebensborn also matters for how we think about complicity and responsibility. In the past decade, as the last survivors of the Nazi era pass away, there has been increasing focus on the roles played by ordinary people. Not the high-ranking ideologues or the camp guards, but the clerks, the nurses, the social workers, the bureaucrats who kept the machinery running. Lebensborn is a case study in this kind of complicity. The people who staffed these homes were not monsters. They were professionals doing their jobs within a system that had normalized atrocity. They filled out forms, provided medical care, processed adoptions. Each action was mundane. The cumulative effect was the erasure of thousands of lives. This reality forces uncomfortable questions. Would we recognize if we were part of such a system? If our profession, our institution, our government asked us to implement policies that seemed reasonable on the surface but served a monstrous end, would we see it? Would we resist? The ease with which Lebensborn personnel rationalized their work suggests that most people would not. The capacity for self-deception and moral compartmentalization is vast. We want to believe we would be the exception, the whistleblower, the resistor. History suggests otherwise. In answering the central question, was Lebensborn merely a welfare program or a state kidnapping machine, the evidence compels a clear conclusion. It was both, and that duality was not a contradiction, but the essence of how it functioned. The welfare facade provided legitimacy and cover. It allowed the program to recruit staff from the medical and social services professions who could tell themselves they were helping mothers and children. It created plausible deniability for the regime and complicated post-war prosecution. But beneath that facade, integrated into the same institutional structure, was a systematic operation to abduct children, erase their identities, and assimilate them into the German population. The bureaucratic records leave no room for ambiguity. Rue-Shaw documents detail the racial screenings, the selection criteria, the transport logistics. Lebensborn placement files show children arriving from occupied territories with falsified backgrounds and new names. Testimony from survivors confirms the violence and trauma of the process. Post-war investigations by Allied authorities and subsequent historical research have reconstructed the pipeline in meticulous detail. The connection between Lebensborn and the kidnappings is not speculative. It is documented, verified, and undeniable. The legal insulation of Lebensborn leaders at Nuremberg was a failure of justice, but it was also an artifact of how the program was designed. By distributing culpability across multiple agencies and bureaucratic layers, the Nazis made it difficult to assign clear responsibility. The people who identified children for seizure were often not the same people who transported them, who were not the same people who received them, who were not the same people who arranged their adoptions. Each link in the chain could claim limited knowledge or responsibility. This is a tactic that modern authoritarian systems continue to use, and recognizing it in the Lebensborn case helps us see it elsewhere. For the survivors, there has been no adequate reckoning. Some received modest compensation decades after the war. Some found fragments of their stories through archives and DNA testing. But many lived and died without answers, carrying the weight of stolen identity to the grave. The children born in Germany to unmarried mothers also deserved better. They were instrumentalized by a regime that saw them as genetic resources rather than human beings. Their welfare was always secondary to ideological goals. When we study programs like Lebensborn, we study the mechanics of dehumanization. We learn how easily bureaucracy can be weaponized, how professional norms can be corrupted, how language can obscure violence. The Nazis called it the fountain of life. They spoke of racial health, of family support, of caring for mothers and children. The words were designed to hide the reality. A program that stole children and erased their identities, that subjected human beings to pseudoscientific examinations, that tried to engineer a society based on blood and soil. The lesson is not that these events were unique or that they could never happen again. The lesson is that they were the product of choices made by individuals and institutions, choices that seemed defensible within a particular ideological framework, choices that were enabled by systems designed to diffuse responsibility. Understanding how it happened once is the first step in preventing it from happening again. In the decades since the war, scholars have continued to uncover new details about Lebensborn. Archives in former Soviet territories opened after the Cold War, revealing additional documentation. Survivors came forward with testimonies. Forensic genealogists have used modern DNA techniques to reconnect some stolen children with their biological families. Each new piece of evidence adds to the picture, and the picture that emerges is one of a program far more extensive and damaging than early post-war accounts suggested. Contemporary far-right movements have occasionally tried to rehabilitate Lebensborn, portraying it as a misunderstood welfare initiative, or even as a model for pro-natalist policies. These attempts ignore or minimize the kidnapping component and the racial ideology that underpinned the entire system. They are part of a broader revisionist project that seeks to sanitize Nazi history and make fascist ideas palatable again. Countering this revisionism requires clear, evidence-based narration of what actually happened. The story of Lebensborn is ultimately a story about children. Children torn from their families, children born into a system that valued them only as genetic material, children who grew up not knowing who they were or where they came from. Every statistic represents a life disrupted, a family destroyed, an identity stolen. When we speak of tens of thousands of victims, we are speaking of tens of thousands of individual tragedies, each one irreplaceable and irreparable. It is also a story about ideology, about what happens when pseudoscience is given state power, when human worth is measured by physical characteristics, when a government decides that some lives matter more than others. The ideas that motivated Lebensborn did not die in 1945. They persist in various forms, waiting for moments of crisis and anxiety to resurface. Vigilance requires that we understand the history not as ancient and irrelevant, but as a warning that remains urgent. The professionals who staffed Lebensborn were educated people. They had medical degrees, social work credentials, administrative experience. They were not exceptionally cruel or sadistic. They were ordinary individuals who